Según James Buchanan, premio Nobel en la economía y además doctor honoris causa de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín, se puede resumir la teoría del public choice en 3 palabras: política sin romanticismo. A veces tenemos la idea del gobierno como un gran benefactor, cuando es todo lo contrario. Tenemos que analizarlos como personas con sus propios intereses que toman decisiones no para optimizar el bienestar social, sino su propio bienestar. El Centro para el Análisis de Decisiones Públicas, o CADEP, es el núcleo de investigación del Instituto de Estudios Políticos y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín. El CADEP fue fundado en el 2002 con el objetivo de promover la teoría del public choice, una herramienta para estudiar la política desde un punto de vista económico. Realizamos actividades en toda la región, de coloquios y debates, a conferencias, a incluso presentaciones de nuestras investigaciones. Dentro de las actividades de CADEP tocamos varios temas, desde la burocracia al funcionamiento del sistema democrático, pero también temas cotidianos. Y muchos otros temas. Para más información, les invito a que visiten nuestra página web cadep.ufm.edu. Suscríbanse a nuestro boletín y participen en todas nuestras actividades. Welcome to this event organized by CADEP. CADEP is the public policy, public choice center of the University Francisco Marroquín. We are here to talk with one of our invitees. We have here Niels Carlson. Welcome, Niels.
Thank you.
Niels is the founder of Ratio Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. He is originally from Sweden. He is an economist and a political scientist, a professor at Linköping University, also in Sweden, with a very special Swedish pronunciation. And he's working in fields such as institutional economics, political theory, public choice, industrial relations, constitutional political economy. That's one of the topics we will discuss today with Niels, and much more. So I think there's various angles we can take in this dialogue, discussion, etc. Prior to founding Ratio, he was the president of City University of Stockholm, I think a private university.
It's similar to this one, actually, yeah.
Similar to UFM. And after postgraduate studies in economics at George Mason University and in political science in Uppsala University, he worked as a university lecturer, government advisor, and editorial writer. He's also a board member of Mont Pelerin Society, which we will celebrate a special meeting in Guatemala in the next few days. So that's also why we are very happy and pleased to have him over here in Guatemala. And he has published many books, many in Swedish, but also this specific one, I think 2 years ago, about, it's called Statecraft and Liberal Reform in Advanced Democracies. And he talks about, it's actually case studies about the experiences of liberal reform in Sweden and in Australia. So I urge you to not only look at our event and listen to us in this dialogue, but also check out this book and order it. And read it. And I think there's a lot of valuable lessons in this very book. So we're extremely pleased to have Niels. Welcome, Niels, to Guatemala. Welcome to UFM.
Pleasure to be here. I really enjoy it. And I'm actually giving a class here about the book. So I think the results here, the theory I present there is relevant also for a country like Guatemala.
So any first impressions on Guatemala? Guatemala public policy?
Well, the policies, I'm learning from the students, actually. I know a bit about the history of the country, of course, and I know you have some challenges, but I also think you have great potentials, actually. So, especially with the university at UFM, I think some good ideas are developed here, yeah.
Does the book, we'll discuss the contents of the book in a little while, does the book make you an optimist in general about public policy and
many people think, that reforms are impossible. There are so many special interests. There are so many corrupt politicians. There are so many bad laws. There are so many bad traditions that makes reforms impossible. That's what people thought in Sweden and Australia as well. You know, we had failing welfare states, we had extremely high taxes, we had all kinds of problems. But nevertheless, reform processes took start and they were sustained for 25 years. So I'm an optimist for sure. If you're a classical liberal, you should be an optimist. It's reform is possible. It's possible to liberalize a country, any country, I would say.
Before delving in like the process of liberal reforms, because I think one of the messages of the book and your messages in general is we liberals know what should be done, but this is more a roadmap or the process of getting there. You know? How do we get the right reforms?
I think we have had lots of Nobel laureates, lots of good scholars, lots of good politicians who really know what should be done. But the real challenge is how to do it. So
How to get
that's why I worked on this book for some years, while at the same time working in projects in labor markets, innovation systems, so many different fields actually, thinking about this problem. How can you do it?
Before delving into the contents of the book, I have to ask, because I guess there's a lot of misunderstandings about what is Sweden nowadays. Is Sweden a socialist paradise? And is it true that, for instance, like politicians in the United States, as Bernie Sanders, who say that Sweden is kind of a working model of modern day socialism?
It has never been that, I would say. But in the 70s and 80s, we had very high levels of taxes. We had lots of regulations. We had lots of state monopolies in healthcare, elderly care, and so on and so forth. But from that onwards, from the mid-1980s, for the coming 25 years, most areas were liberalized, actually. So we don't have any wealth tax. We don't have any gift tax. Corporate taxes are low. It's a deregulated economy in many ways, you know. It's quite a liberal place, actually. So that's a myth that Sweden would be a socialist country. There's actually a famous Swedish economist who once said that the difference between Sweden and the Soviet Union is that in Sweden, we never socialized industry. So the market companies has always been private, banks have always been private. But what we did in Sweden in the 70s and 80s was to socialize the family, the role of the family. So all these healthcare systems, all this welfare system was concerned about that, not about socializing the economy, actually.
Before going into the challenge of like liberal reforms, and I guess the troubles we might, or the obstacles we face when we try to implement liberal reforms, I would briefly want to discuss this idea of this extended elite. You can correct my language in a few moments, but this extended elite that really moves and pushes public policy reform. So it's not about the broader public, it's not about the general public and their ideas about what reform should be done, but about some broader elite. And maybe we can comment on the term you use, political entrepreneur. So you distinguish between a market entrepreneur, a businessman, and a political entrepreneur. Could you explain this concept and why is it so important in this extended elite?
Let's start with what I call the central zone here in the book. It's a term coined by an American sociologist, Childs, in the 60s even, I think, you know. And it's an extended elite, not only central decision makers in politics and so on, but the business sector, religious leader, artists, academic professors, you know, people who in a society are, well, setting the tone, so to speak. What is important? Where should we go? What matters in this society? So if you can affect the people in this central zone, and it's an extended zone, new people can enter into it. It's not only the central decision maker, the established politicians. That was not the case in any of these countries, actually. So if we can make them think in a different way, people will follow. So in none of the cases, actually, in Sweden, there was one election over these 25 years that they won on a platform saying, we're going to change the system, you know.
The political class.
Yeah. There was one, Carl Bildt was his leader, was the prime minister of Sweden. So he said in 1991, and this is after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Soviet Union collapsing and all this, he could win an election by saying, yes, we're going to change the system here in Sweden. Apart from that, all politicians said, no, we're going to restore the good old bad model, But once they came back into power, they continued to do the reforms. So I think this is a general truth that it's one thing to win elections. It's another thing to do reforms. And in order to do the reforms, you have to win these central actors in the central zone. Yeah.
Like I think in modern day we would talk about influencers, no? But we tend to associate them with Instagram, but actually they're all over the place in different industries.
Could be religious leaders, could be business leaders, could be academic professors, as I said, people who others look up to, who understand what goes on. I mean, ordinary people don't have the time, the effort, and so on, to be well informed about economics, about politics, about all these things. But some people do. And if you can make them pick up the right ideas, classical liberal ideas, I believe really are the right ideas for a country to prosper and develop well, then you can achieve something.
And if they adopt the right ideas, transmit them in society, as well as pushing for reforms, that makes them political entrepreneurs?
Some of them are political entrepreneurs. Political entrepreneurs are specific individuals within this group, I would say, or people coming from outside that group and moving into the group by being policy entrepreneurs. So what they do, they advocate ideas, they develop ideas, and they promote these ideas in various ways and connect and collaborate with various political, economic groups that have resources in a society. It's not enough to have ideas. You also need force, in a sense, power to influence politics in a good way. So ideas, entrepreneurs without the support of important power groups or groups with resources, could be organizations, could be political parties, but it could also be the business sector. If that happens, then it's possible to promote reforms.
I just thought about a different question, but in Guatemala, there's this idea that the business sector is a really bad influence. So they actually have a name for it. They say CADEP, which is one of the organizations formed by businessmen who might push or not push for political reforms, certain political reforms. And the idea is that political elites control the economy, and that is wrong. But in fact, we can see that maybe the business sector, maybe for good or for bad, have resources, and the real challenge is how to use the resources for good, for liberal reforms, maybe. Is that the right way to put it, or would you put it differently?
I mean, it's an interesting difference here between Sweden and Australia, which I think can illustrate this. The difference is if the business sector is pro-business or if it's pro-market. So in Australia, you had a very regulated economy, you had high tariffs, perhaps a bit similar to Guatemala, actually. In Sweden, we had high taxes, we had some regulations in the service sector, and so on and so forth. But the business organizations turned themselves into pro-market policy entrepreneurs. So they really favored reforms that in the long run were good for all businesses, for all people in Sweden. In Australia, it was actually the labor movement and the Labour Party that pushed for the liberal reforms, while the business sector, parts of the business sector, wanted to protect their own businesses, wanted to keep up the high tariffs and so on, wanted to keep the regulations, stifling competition and so on. So I think in the long run, in Guatemala, as in all countries, the business sector benefits from competition. They benefit from open markets. They benefit from free trade, open borders. So I think that could be a way forward for Guatemala. If you have a business roundtable here, if you have a chamber of commerce that could make itself into a pro-market activist, that would be very interesting, yeah.
So this central zone includes not just political decision makers, not just Congress members or presidents or ministers. It actually includes artists, academics, professors.
Usually the bad guys are in politics, So if you want to make reforms, you have to bring in other groups here who can influence the system, and they can. that's what's been shown in this book and in many other studies.
Do you have an example from Sweden, like a concrete non-political decision maker who, in that central zone, manages to maybe facilitate or push for reform?
Let me take one example, a couple examples, Sweden, and some different examples from Australia. In Sweden, as I said, the Swedish Confederation of Industries, the major business organization, which was part of the corporate model, collaborating with the politics and so on, for decades, realized that this was disastrous for Sweden in the long run. We needed free markets, we needed entrepreneurship, we needed, open borders and so on. And they transformed themselves and used all their resources to promote market liberal ideas. And within that organization, there were specific individuals, actually quite a few people, who made this change, who made this change possible. But there were also other people, for example, economists within the Department of Finance, working for government, being social democrats, who also picked up these classical liberal ideas and started to promote them within the social democratic government. Quite interesting. To give an example from Australia, which I also think is very illustrative, is that the director of the tariff board, the organizations that administered the tariffs and the import quotas and everything in Australia, measured how hard they were and so on, the tariffs. He became a pro-market policy entrepreneur. So he started to publish papers, articles saying that, in fact, these tariffs are disastrous for Australia.
It's bad for his own job, maybe.
Even for his own job.
Yeah.
And that tariff board later on became a competition commission, later on a productivity commission that still exists, a governmental agency that promotes good reforms in Australia. It's quite a fascinating story. So you can find, counterintuitive, but you can find these kind of people who pick up the right ideas, who understand what really promotes prosperity, welfare, and so on in society in many different sectors.
So if Guatemalans would like to push for free market reforms, do they have to identify and go after those potential
I think you should support.
I think
you have those people. You should support them. You should give them resources. You should back them, in various ways, economically, but also in other ways, And also, it's important, and this is also, I think, a lesson in this book, is that these policy entrepreneurs sometimes form what's called policy advocacy coalitions with other policy entrepreneurs, pushing for the same reforms, but perhaps for different reasons. So we had a major agriculture reform in Sweden that, I think the first ideas came from an academic professor who wrote a book about the iron triangle and how agriculture sector was regulated with bureaucrats and everything and producers and so on. But at the same time, there were people, housewives that started to have demonstrations in the streets and so on because of the high food prices. And a number of groups like this collided, pushing for reforms, perhaps for different reasons, with different ideological backgrounds. But that's what made reforms possible.
It's interesting. We might have some examples in Guatemala as well, but I would like to go to this idea about liberal reform.
Yeah.
So maybe some of our followers also have read Ludwig von Mises or Hayek. Friedrich Hayek wrote a book, of course, wrote Serfdom. Mises wrote Interventionism, which basically makes the case that liberal reform is kind of a utopia. No? As soon as you allow government to expand and grow, there's no limit to the expansion of government. And you end up actually, might be the argument of Ludwig von Mises, for instance, in socialism, no? Where you have a completely, where government actually covers all kind of areas within an economy. So in this book, you cite the case of Sweden and Australia, which show actually the opposite. They have reached, with the welfare state, a certain size and scope of government, maybe that's a better word than size, the scope of government, and then they managed to push for liberal reforms, reducing maybe the scope of the state. How would you reflect upon this, and what is the key for these liberal reforms, which might be impossible in the minds of Ludwig von Mises and Hayek?
I actually did my doctoral thesis on this very problem of the growth of the state as an unintended consequence of human action. So about spontaneous orders in politics, actually. So I had two explanations here. One was the Misesian Hayekian logic. I call it the logic of conceit. Politicians who believe they do the good things, but they end up creating really bad problems by destroying markets, civil society, and so on. Then I had the other logic, which would be the public choice school with Buchanan, Tullock, and other people, which I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with as well. And I call this the logic of opportunism. So I studied how these interacted within a system of an unconstrained democracy, showing that, well, the processes would end up into something I call the state of state. A society totally dominated with the state, with a small market sector, small civil society. So my big question in my doctoral thesis was, how can we get out of this? That's why I, 20 years later, published this other book, you know. And you need people. If you really want to get out of this system, you need people who knew how to do reforms. They have to understand these processes. You have to influence those people in the central zone that we discussed. You have to combine into these advocacy policy coalitions and so on. But you also need some people who are, in game theoretical language, unconditional cooperators. They really believe in the classical liberal ideas. They're willing to take the fight. They're willing to invest parts of their lives to favor these ideas, even though it's costly in the short run. Even though they may lose their academic career, even though they may be ostracized, you know, socially for various reasons, but you need that. And not only to, you know, get out of this public choice, public goods dilemma that countries end up with, where it's very hard to favor these liberal ideas, you know, because it's a collective good, many of the things, liberty, free trade, and so on. It's good for everyone in the long run, but the incentives to do it in the short run for most people are quite weak, unfortunately. Free riders are exploiting the rest of us in many ways here. So you need these people who are unconditionally willing to act as policy entrepreneur and push for these ideas. And perhaps the UFM is such an example here in Guatemala.
Let's hope so. But
yeah.
my doubt with all this is, we've talked about this off camera, but when the state is big, a lot of people directly depend for their incomes on the state.
Sure.
You create dependencies, no? I think we talked about how many people depend on government spending in Sweden, in Holland, and probably not so much in Guatemala. But if that is an obstacle because they are literally sacrificing their own income for some kind of public reform, policy reform, at least in the short run, is it enough to have this small minority of liberals who are pushing ideas, even though it comes at a personal cost?
I calculated the number of people in Sweden who were dependent directly and indirectly by the government for the majority of their income. People being employed by government, people living on unemployment subsidies, living on welfare, being students, being pensioners, and so on. And it added up to more than 50%. So how could you get out of this situation?
Right, because of democracy.
So if you're an economist, if you're a political choice scholar, it would have been impossible, right? But if you're a political scientist, and I'm both, you can enter ideas, ideologies, mental frames, ways of thinking, and that's really what explains how these two countries could reform themselves. And I think it's the same for Guatemala. If we could change the way people think about how society works, what kind of government you need, then they will look at all these incentives in a different way, interpret them in a different way, and may start acting in a different way. And that's what happened in the central zones in these two countries I've studied here. And it should be possible here as well.
Do you think then that public choice theory is not able to explain everything? Is that what I can conclude? It explains some of political behavior?
I definitely think so. I mean, economists are usually quite narrow-minded. They think they have the model, but it's actually one way of looking at society. But we also need people from sociology, from anthropology, from ethics, from various fields who understand that the world is more complex than this quite simplified model. Even though I think the Austrian model, and I know you favor that here at UFM, is better than the neoclassical model. It's still a model. Also, the Miesian model is a model. So we need to bring in other things here that matters to people. Meaning, identity, many other things that are important for how society works. If we want to understand how society works, we need a broader spectrum of ways to interpret what goes on, and also how you can use those other aspects of life and society to influence politics in the right direction. Yeah.
So this book is actually about how to reduce the state, the scope of the state and government. The other question, of course, that arises, especially for a smaller state, as is the case with many Latin American countries, among which Guatemala, how do we prevent from becoming Sweden 1980s in the first place? How do we prevent government from getting to that point where we need liberal reforms, radical liberal reforms, to push back on the scope of the state? And how do you avoid ending up in a welfare crisis or welfare state crisis? What are some of the mechanisms to avoid expansion of government?
I think the most important thing is what I just said. It's about ideas. If you really understand that the big government is a big problem, it's not good for society. High taxes, lots of regulations, lots of monopolies, it's bad. It has bad consequences. It hampers growth. It hampers welfare of people. That's the most basic thing. Guatemala has a fairly small state, but it's a very soft state. So it's not doing the right thing. It's not upholding the rule of law, private property rights, well, delivering what society needs in order to prosper and develop. So you need to, I think, increase your state capacity here and make the state harder, stronger in some ways, to uphold what really promotes market, civil society in a good way. But then on, you have to find ways of stopping it from growing to a larger size, of course, And ideas is not enough. It's, I think, the most important thing, but you also need a good constitution, of course. That's the idea of James Buchanan. I'm a student of James Buchanan, the public choice scholar, who was a constitutional economist, and who really argued that it's not really policies which is the problem. What is the problem is the weak constitutions of many countries, making it possible to make bad decisions all the time and time and time again. So what we need is a government that is constrained, a limited government that is constrained by a democracy that is constrained by a good constitution. So that's the challenge, of course.
And what happens whenever a democracy maybe, or a majority of people or voters do not see the value in having a document like the Constitution limiting precisely the scope of government? What happens when we start entering a spiral where constitutional reform is something like introducing some smaller public policy reform, when it becomes normal?
I would say that many constitutional reforms that takes place, and Sweden did one in the late 60s, early 70s, pushed things in the wrong direction. So we made our system more proportional, well, more majoritarian in many ways. We abolished the two-chamber system. Well, we did a lot of bad things, actually, and it was pushed by parties opposing the welfare state, actually. But they wanted more influence, and they thought that a more direct type of democracy with less restrictions in the form of a two-chamber system and so on would benefit their cause. But in the end, it's been the other way around, of course. And I think Latin America have similar experiences in a sense. You've had fantastic constitutions in this continent, but they don't seem to have done a good job because they turned into something after some time. They've been changed. The culture have not been supporting. People have not supported the strong constitutions in the way they have in the US, for example. You copy the US Constitution here in many countries. I don't know enough about Guatemala, but my guess would be that you had constitution at one point in a time, at least, that's similar to the US Constitution.
So it's going back to before going into the whole constitution, constitutional limits of government. I think it's a very important topic, especially because I think it's a very delicate issue, constitutional reform in Guatemala. But I would like to go back to how do we avoid populists? Nobody likes taxes, no? Nobody likes to pay taxes. They like other people paying taxes. And in general, in Latin America, that means making businesses pay for taxes or rich people pay for taxes, which is not really present maybe in modern day Sweden, no? Could you explain why high taxes does not always mean the same thing? It also matters who you charge taxes to. How does it work in Sweden? Who bears the weight and the brunt of the tax?
It's we touched upon this before when we discussed state capacity in a sense, you know. So as I understand Guatemala, I'm no expert on Guatemala, but this soft state you have here can't collect taxes, right? So large of the economy is, so to speak, outside the reach of the state. Lots of the businesses are outside, lots of the people living here don't pay taxes because, well, it's an informal economy in many ways, you know. Sweden, of course, is a very different society. We still have high trust in each other, but also in government usually, you know. So both vertical trust and horizontal trust is quite strong in Sweden. So people, of course, not everyone wants to pay taxes. It's the same problem as anywhere, you know. You want someone else to do. It's the same kind of free riding problem. But if you want to have a state that does these essential things, at least I'm talking about, you need some tax, you need to collect some taxes. So what happened in Sweden after this period in the 70s and 80s, where both businesses and ordinary people were, well, taxed in a very disastrous way. So marginal tax rates were perhaps 90%, you know.
It's a famous Volvo case, no? I think.
Yeah, there are many cases like this, you know, and for small businesses, the taxes were confiscatory, more or less, you know. But people realized after some time, you know, this was absurd. It had very bad consequences. So we had a major tax reform in 1991, lower all these marginal taxes, broadening the tax base in certain ways, shifting all kinds of taxes. So you couldn't really calculate winners and losers here. And this is still the case, you know. So we don't have wealth taxes, we don't have gift taxes, corporate taxes are quite low, capital taxes are still a bit high, but they're fairly decent, I would say. You know? So doing business in Sweden is very attractive, actually. Most people still pay individual taxes. Individual income taxes are still too high, way too high.
So taxes are basically concentrated on consumption and workers.
And workers
laborers.
And consumption, you know. So if you add up the taxes in Sweden, direct, indirect taxes, value-added taxes and so on, I would say 90% of the taxes are taxes on income earners. So how they can support that is a big surprise to me, but I've been fighting it all life without being able to change it. Yeah.
Before going into the whole issue of constitutions and good practices and bad practices, I just have to ask, because in Sweden, one of the things a typical educated Guatemalan would know is the idea that Sweden has public healthcare and public education, which doesn't imply that the government executes and runs education and runs healthcare. Could you comment a little bit on how they reformed those two sectors?
That was part of these reforms, this process that started. This started in the 90s, actually, early 1990s. I was actually working for that government when it comes to higher education and science and so. And at the same time, the school system was reformed, the healthcare system was reformed, making it possible to have vouchers in the school system. So we have private schools, we have non-profit private schools, we have for-profit private schools, getting the average cost, local cost of a public school as a voucher. So if I've had my children in these kinds of private schools. So it's up to me. I choose which school I want my children to go to. And if they go to this private school, the local government will have to pay a voucher in the size of the average cost of a public school to this private school. And this has worked very, very well, I think. It has stimulated competition, of course, but it has also promoted the quality of the public school.
Right.
Competition is a discovery procedure, right? As Hayek said, Now, at the moment, we're seeing a bit of a backlash here. There's a big political discussion about these for-profit schools, because you had some bad guys, of course, some rotten apples, among those private school providers who more or less didn't give the good education they should have given to the students or the pupils. But I think we will handle this, Healthcare, same thing. You could choose if you want to go to a private provider, and you will get subsidized by the same amount as a public provider. These systems aren't perfect. I'm actually working currently on a project where I use Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom's perspective about polycentric governments asking for the introduction of various kinds of insurance systems here. Not abolishing all public subsidies. I think we need them in these systems, but I would see more of polycentricity here, more pluralism, more of choice, more of exit and entry for everyone, actually, both for the providers and for the users of these systems.
Instead of one state running the whole healthcare
the state
business.
Is not running it, it's funding it in Sweden. But I also want the financing of the system to be partly private,
Right. And people can pick their schools, and the government will pay the subsidy to a private school if somebody wishes
That's
to
how
go
it
to a
works
private
now,
school.
and it works well,
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
So
it's Milton Friedman's idea, basically, that we implement in Sweden.
Which would be very far from the idea that education and healthcare is run completely by the state and by the public sector.
It's still regulated, it's still financed by government in Sweden. I want more private incentives within these systems.
It's not perfect yet.
It's not perfect yet. Nothing is perfect, So we have to work on it all the time. Reform process shouldn't stop.
Well, talking about imperfect things and not so perfect things, I guess the constitutions would fit right in that scheme. No, we have different constitutions. Of course, in the United States, we have a constitution written based on individual rights, in a way trying to protect individual rights from state intervention. So what are some of the practices that you might have noticed, or ways in which these documents, constitutions, can help us limit government, the scope of government, and also the opportunistic behavior sometimes of the political class?
Well, that opportunistic behavior is there all the time, of course, even you have some decent people sometimes. That's a temptation to be short-term oriented, to perhaps not not abiding to the rule of law. So it's very important that the politicians themselves are under the law, right? If they're not under the law, why should we be, right? So how do you do this? This is a challenge, of course. And I think it's more or less well known how you should do this. You need checks and balances. You need some kind of individual rights, right? And you need this principle of legality upheld by independent courts. So I think these independent courts is a key thing here. And I think that would be a key thing for Guatemala, to strengthen that system, not having them too closely connected to politics in various ways, but really make them independent and strengthen their role within the political system. And that's not undemocratic. Some people think that. No, to have a constitutional democracy is what democracy is about. Otherwise, you may have, simple majorities exploiting minorities. You may have all kinds of problems in a society that in the long run will destroy democracy and the prosperity of a society.
So if democracy for you doesn't mean giving voice to a majority opinion?
Absolutely not. It means constitutional democracy. I should be very clear here. We don't want illiberal democracies. We've had a trend over the last decades in the world here. Russia, Turkey, parts of Eastern Europe, surely some countries in Latin America, where you have general elections, you have majorities that makes decisions that really aren't democratic, I would say, because they don't, well, defend individual rights, they don't defend the role of minorities, they don't defend free press, they don't defend the pluralistic society where you can have public discussions, free media, and so on and so forth. That's not democratic. So constitutional democracy is what democracy should be about, not majority rule by itself.
Okay, let's delve a bit more in constitutions. So what happens whenever it tends to happen in Latin America, no? So instead of focusing on rules and institutions, people focus much on persons and people. If only we had the right guys, the good guys in government, everything would be fine. I guess the idea of a liberal democracy and constitutional limits is in fact the opposite. No, we cannot trust in people in such a way that they will always act in the public good. So therefore, we have to have rules, mechanisms, checks and balances to make sure that even if angels do not enter government, we still have a functioning system and we can protect individual rights, liberal democracy, etc.
It's actually, just a broad discussion, that's the main message of this book, actually. It's not about political leadership. It's not about strong guys or women taking the lead, deciding what to do because they're so bright and informed. It's about the extended elites, that policy entrepreneurs, the central zone that needs to promote these good things. That's what statecraft is about. And this tendency you had in many Latin America, and the Cordillos, the strong man, and I read something last night about El Salvador and this guy there, and well, we know what's happened in Nicaragua and many other places. It's a sad story. So those, and you can see it in other countries. You can see it in the Philippines with Duterte. You can see it with Putin in Russia. You can see it with in Turkey, and well, all over the world, actually. It may be good for some years, but slowly but steadily they become corrupt. They don't follow the law anymore. They believe they're above the law. Well, so you lose this constitutional control that I think is so important. That what democracy is about, what a good society is about. So you can secure these individual rights, private property rights, well, long-term oriented rules that a good society has to uphold with. So forget about the strong man. That's not the solution. You have to do the work yourself. No one else will do it for you.
Can you define for our audience rule of law? What does it mean? What does rule of law mean? What does it involve?
Rule of law consists of a couple of different things, But I think the most important thing is the legality principle. It says that a good society is not made by people, it's made by law. So it's law that builds a good society, right? And by law, we mean rules that are general, that applies to everyone, also to the politicians and decision makers themselves, also to the rich, and also to the poor, of course. So that means that in a system of rule of law, you have to have independent courts, you have to have judicial review, saying that governments, politicians can't make whatever decisions they want to. They have to follow the laws themselves, and especially the constitutional laws. So that's the essence, I think, of the rule of law. And there's so much research by economists, by political scientists, by all kinds of people showing that the rule of law is more fundamental than democracy if you want to have a good society. Societies that upholds the rule of law, that is a liberal society, functions well, promotes prosperity, promotes, well, a good life, good welfare for most people.
Having an independent courts, or having independent courts, and taking away politics from judicial systems and protecting rule of law, is it feasible? Is it possible?
it's not taken away completely. I mean, it must be some kind of system on checks and balances. So even the courts have to be legitimate in a democratic way. But they have to be legitimate in a democratic way in a very indirect sense. We can't have the politicians themselves that appoints the judges, for example. So you have to have checks and balances. You have to do this within the constitution. So I define democracy as combining, well, the courts, constitutional court, but also ordinary courts. Ordinary courts should not implement laws. They shouldn't implement laws that are unlawful, that are unconstitutional, right? So we had a reform in Sweden. I was very much part of that in 2010, strengthening this judicial review system and also strengthening private property rights in various ways. That was not the case in Sweden before, but now it is, So that's very important. The whole judicial system needs to respect, well, the constitution and not letting short-term oriented populist politicians make decisions that are not in accordance with the constitution or the overall system of laws. But you have to construct this system in a way that they balance each other. Like everyone knows about the US, you have the Supreme Court, you have the executive, the president, and then you have a two-chamber Congress. So that's a system that, has been stable for like 200 years, even though they had problems and have huge problems today, I would say. But it's something like this. And I want to add this. It's not, you can't import it from abroad. You have to build it in your own country. You have to build on your own traditions, unless you have an external enforcer that, make sure that this constitution stays in place and is adhered to,
Can we view the United States as a case of success? Well, I guess you're arguing because of the time and the recent success of the United States economically, but also politically, in the sense that it's pretty stable compared to other regimes in the world. But if I look at indicators such as public spending or federal spending in the case of the US as a percentage of the US economy, can we still uphold the idea that the Constitution has been able to limit government in the United States? Or are we failing, or have we been failing since recently? What are some lessons we could?
I think what's happened, with this credit expansion we've seen since '87 and onwards, it's been extremely disastrous, very problematic. Lately, we've seen this huge increases in government spending, not caring about budget deficits and so on. Extremely problematic, and it will have very bad consequences. Both these facts, and it's not a perfect system, but it's the best we know of. I mean, it's like Churchill said that democracy is not perfect, but it's the best system that exists. And I do think the U.S. system is one of the best ones, actually. So even though it looks a bit grim, right now, I think they will handle it somehow. It will take some time. But the U.S. had been in problem before, in the 60s with the Vietnam War, corrupt presidents, huge deficits. They managed to get out of it. They got Reagan after, a couple of presidents, and the U.S. get back on track, Let's hope I think they will again. I'm optimistic there as well.
You're an optimist,
of course,
and the book is very optimistic in a certain sense. At least with respect to liberal reforms. As Sweden, just to maybe summarize, I mean, you had this welfare state crisis in the 70s and 80s. Then you had liberal reforms. You had lower taxes. You had a reform of the educational system, the healthcare system. And nowadays, even though the scope of the state, or the size of the state, the Swedish state is pretty big, it doesn't try to run everybody's lives, and it doesn't have the same problems as it did in the 80s and 90s. We know much little. You can also comment on Sweden, but we don't know as much about Australia. Can you just briefly summarize what happened in Australia, why it's relevant for the same idea of liberal reform, and what are the reforms they actually managed to implement in Australia?
Let me just say first, Sweden is not at all perfect. I mean, the state is way too big, relations are extensive, but it's a lot better than it was. So it's a lot more free society. Sweden has improved its position in all these freedom indexes, in competition indexes. It's a well-working country, I would say, in those dimensions. Australia is extremely interesting. They didn't have a big welfare state in the Scandinavian sense. They have almost half the tax rates, tax share of GDP as Sweden. But they had what they call the Australian settlement, which was kind of welfare state arrangement, state paternalism, wage arbitration. So all wages were set in arbitration courts. They didn't bargain about wages, not even collectively, not individual. Wages were set in a certain kind of arbitration courts. They had all kinds of regulations in industry. They have all kinds of protectionist measures, very high tariffs and so on. And they only had people coming from Northern Europe, white Australia it was called, So they didn't take people coming from Pakistan, from Asia, from Latin America, nowhere. No, they just wanted, Brits, Scandinavians, Germans to come there, really. That made Australia, have all kinds of problems. Welfare were falling. They came into a crisis, and they started to reform. And one of the most interesting things was that they unilaterally took down their protectionist measures and supports from manufacturing and industry. I think that's a lesson here from Guatemala. So even though industry, the business sector, it's many sectors, not all sectors, but many sectors were against these deregulations and taking away the protectionist measures, they did it, And that really triggered competition, it triggered growth, it triggered entrepreneurship, innovation, and so on. So Australia started to prosper, growth picked up, new jobs were created, very successful story. And an interesting thing here in Australia, they basically deregulated this economy. Labor market reforms, tariffs reforms, all kinds of reforms, tax reforms, bringing bargaining down to firm level, no collective agreements even, And it was done they did it for 25 years as well. And the first 12 years by labor governments in support from the labor unions. So one of the most important policy entrepreneurs in Australia was the secretary of the Australian Trade Union Organization. Bill Kelty was his name. So he became a liberal policy entrepreneur. Can you imagine that? With the argument saying that regulations, tariffs are bad for Australian consumers. It's bad for the jobs here. We haven't seen any growth in real wages and so on. Let's open this country up.
That's interesting because normally we know the stories from England. We know Margaret Thatcher and her fight with labor unions. And in the case of Australia, was the opposite. It was actually labor union leaders or leader.
In that case, that's true. The Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, he was a former labor union leader who was the Prime Minister, started the whole process.
Just to pick out one specific reform in Australia, you mentioned the unilateral liberalization of trade, which means that we as Australia say we're not going to charge any import tariffs to other countries, without even negotiating per se free trade agreements, which is basically how it's done. Free trade agreements, as people might know at home, they take a very long time to negotiate, and sometimes they're not even as free as the term might imply. No?
To be honest, we have this GATT and WTO, negotiations, and nowadays they don't function at all. They don't work, So the world has moved into more bilateral things, but Australia did it partly unilateral because they realized free trade was a good thing. Coming back to Adam Smith and, many of the classical liberals, understanding this. So I think Guatemala should do the same.
Even with England in the 19th century, maybe to relate it with Guatemala, in Guatemala we have tariffs. No?
Yeah.
That might be a problem, especially when they're 15-20% on some of the imported goods. But as well, we have non-tariff barriers.
Sure.
So we've seen a lot of opposition in opening trade, no? Even if it's unilaterally, even if we don't want to wait on other countries or negotiations or free trade agreements, we could say we just bring tariffs to zero, and that's that. But you have all these different interests, no? You have businesses who might seek rents because they can sell their own product, because they're not competing at equal competition with foreign products. You might have governments that obviously perceive or have fiscal income from the import tariffs. All those interests, how can we in Guatemala take the lesson from Australia and align interests in such a way that even though there's all those particular conflicting interests, that we can push for such a specific reform?
That was exactly the case in Australia, and we had similar situations in Sweden, but in other areas, you know. So we need to bring in those policy entrepreneurs. We need to support them. We need to shift the ideas, you know, how people think about this, to get this rolling, you know. You need to become more pro-market, not pro-business. It's a disaster in the long run to be pro-business. You need to have competition. You need to have open markets. Well, no barriers to the outside. You need to bring in capital. You need to bring in competence to this country, you know. You need foreign investments here. And you can't do that unless you handle this in a better way.
So we have to look for our own labor union leader.
Well, maybe it could be an academic professor from UFM. Maybe it could be, well, parts of the business community starting to act in a more wise way, I would say, you know. I'm sure they can.
It's interesting. I can also tell our audience, actually, there are some surveys on in Guatemala about how the general public views those kind of reforms, and they actually view them very favorable. They completely know that free trade generates jobs, lowers prices of consumer goods and goods in general, and many other benefits that arise by free trade. So the real question is, why don't we have free trade and unilateral liberalization, trade liberalization?
Why don't you have politicians pushing for such an agenda? Right. That should be possible.
That should be in their self-interest as well.
They should.
Okay, so we have Sweden, Australia. We have this great book, Statecraft and Liberal Forum in Advanced Democracies. I want to ask just real quick, why does it say in advanced democracies? Is it specifically because Australia and Sweden, which might be considered
when I did the book, I decided to focus on welfare state and advanced democracies, you know, because there was no work on statecraft in these kinds of society. When I surveyed the literature about statecraft, it was all about international relations, negotiations, well, perhaps third world countries, African countries, and so on. So it didn't exist research theories about statecraft actually in modern societies. So that was the reason. But I've learned here in Guatemala, I'm giving this class here, that this theory, which combines what I call the reform cycle, different actors, where the policy entrepreneurs, the new ideas are the key actors, actually, combining with, well, people have resources, groups and interests that have resources in society to influence policy, together with different reform strategies and also what I call polycentric experiential learning within this extended elite, the central zone. That theory could fit to Guatemala quite well as well. So that the theory itself, the results here, is not limited to advanced democracies.
Can you explain briefly what policy reform cycle, was it the term?
I summarized existing research about, well, institutional change, basically. And I synthesized this into what I call the reform cycle, starting with, you have to recognize that in all societies, and you have the same challenge, you have economic, social problems of various kinds. The conditions here may not be perfect. So the question is, you know, where are the ideas out there? Maybe you can pick them up from some classics, from Hayek, Mises and others, maybe from examples around the world. Maybe you have smart people here yourself who can develop these ideas that can make proposals for how to improve the social economic conditions of Guatemala. But ideas is not enough. You also need policy entrepreneurs. who could advocate, aggregate, promote these ideas in a good way, you know. But the entrepreneurs themselves, I started out saying, it's not enough. You need political resources, interests that support these policy entrepreneurs. So you have to interact within this circle, and thus you can get reforms processes going. So if you can handle the political process, get the resources, power resources to influence politics through this circle, you may promote, you may better the social economic conditions, you may find new ideas that could make it even better, and you can get this circle going, you know. So I think this reform circle, as I call it, works for both individual reforms, but also for this long-term process. So that's one of the results of this book, actually.
Okay, well, just on an ending note, maybe we could ask you to give the 3 lessons or whatever number of lessons you would give to us by this book for Guatemala in a few days and a few impressions that you have of the country. What are some of the 3 key takeaways for Guatemala relating to your experience, your analysis of Australia, of Sweden, and of all the wisdom that is in this book?
Start working with the good ideas, try to identify them, develop them yourself, support policy entrepreneurs with resources, with interest and so on, and make sure to do these reforms that you need. Get the reform circle going. I mean, no one thought in Australia or Sweden that this would be possible. Everyone said it's impossible.
Right.
But we still did it. So it should be possible in this country as well.
So an optimistic word about Guatemala from the experience in Sweden.
Yeah, I think so.
From the 80s until
I think so.
Today. What are some of the challenges that remain for Sweden? You've already said it, it's not perfect. What is the next step that Sweden should take?
Sweden, I think, deregulated, low taxes, fixed many things in a very good way, actually, with 3 exceptions. First of all, the taxes are still way too high, especially for ordinary people. This creates all kinds of problems in the economy. This means it's very expensive for people to buy services, for example, because there's tax wages coming in here between sellers and buyers, you know. So the taxes they should be brought down to half, something like this, you know. That will take a lot of effort. Second thing is labor markets, which were heavily regulated and still are, but now actually a reform is taking place in Sweden. So employment protection legislation and so on, which caused lots of problems, are now being reformed. I've been very much involved in this myself. So actually, there was some news on the news today that now the reform will actually take place. I'm very optimistic about this. Then it's the housing market. So we have rent control in Sweden. So the prices can't fluctuate really in the housing market. Not for private houses, not for condominiums and so on, but for the rental market. It's a price control which we have since the Second World War, which causes shortages, queues, you know, all kinds of, inefficiency. Exactly what Hayek and Mises would predict from the interventionist logic, you know, that we discussed previously. So we need to fix that. But otherwise, I think it's just keep the good work going, you know. Don't think you're finished. That's a challenge for Sweden and for Australia. The sad thing is that in both these countries, in Sweden, the process stopped in 2010, more or less. Since then, we haven't had many good reforms, except for this labor market reform that's coming up now. In Australia, the process stopped in 2007. So the labor unions, the Labour Party, weren't pro-market anymore, you know. They became good old socialists again, you know, and the conservatives became more conservative. So they forgot about these good lessons they had learned, what made Australia to such a successful. They don't have any public debt at all. I mean, they don't have any debt. It's a fantastic country, you know. I've been there a few times, and it's one of the most attractive places in the world, I would say.
Well, we could take a lot more lessons from Australia, especially from the public debt and the public spending and deficits from government. I would urge everybody to take a look at this book, Statecraft and Liberal Reform in Advanced Democracies. Thank you very much for your time,
My
Niels.
pleasure.
This has been a very pleasant conversation. I would invite you as well to go to our webpage, www.cadep.ufm.edu. And we publish on all these kind of topics on public debt, on healthcare, on education, and what kind of reforms might function in Guatemala, taking into account the lessons not only in Australia, Sweden, but also in countries such as Singapore,
Sure.
the Netherlands, my own country, but also neighboring countries. No? So I invite you to subscribe to our newsletter on our website, cadep.ufm.edu, and please stay tuned for other events in the future. And I would like to take a moment to thank Niels for his presence at UFM in Guatemala, and we're looking forward to hearing much more about your work and all your other studies as well. So thank you very much, Niels.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Yeah.
Según James Buchanan, premio Nobel en la economía y además doctor honoris causa de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín, se puede resumir la teoría del public choice en 3 palabras: política sin romanticismo. A veces tenemos la idea del gobierno como un gran benefactor, cuando es todo lo contrario. Tenemos que analizarlos como personas con sus propios intereses que toman decisiones no para optimizar el bienestar social, sino su propio bienestar. El Centro para el Análisis de Decisiones Públicas, o CADEP, es el núcleo de investigación del Instituto de Estudios Políticos y Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín. El CADEP fue fundado en el 2002 con el objetivo de promover la teoría del public choice, una herramienta para estudiar la política desde un punto de vista económico. Realizamos actividades en toda la región, de coloquios y debates, a conferencias, a incluso presentaciones de nuestras investigaciones. Dentro de las actividades de CADEP tocamos varios temas, desde la burocracia al funcionamiento del sistema democrático, pero también temas cotidianos. Y muchos otros temas. Para más información, les invito a que visiten nuestra página web, cadep.ufm.edu. Suscríbanse a nuestro boletín y participen en todas nuestras actividades.